She chose her toxic friend over documented proof of manipulation, so I found someone who actually values truth and loyalty. The whole situation taught me that sometimes love isn't enough when someone refuses to see reality. I met Lisa at a charity auction for local animal shelters in downtown Phoenix, where we both ended up bidding on the same vintage Miles Davis record from 1957. She had this infectious laugh when I jokingly suggested we could share custody of it, alternating weekends like divorced parents, and something about her genuine enthusiasm for obscure jazz pressings made me forget about everyone else in the crowded gallery. We spent the rest of the evening talking about our shared passion for vintage record collecting, discovering we both had impressive collections spanning everything from Blue Note first pressings to rare European imports, plus an almost obsessive knowledge of pressing dates, catalog numbers, and liner note trivia that most people found insufferably nerdy. Our first real date was a late-night desert stargazing adventure where she brought her grandfather's antique brass telescope and I packed a thermos of perfectly timed coffee that we sipped while watching meteor showers paint brilliant streaks across the impossibly clear Arizona sky. Those early months felt absolutely magical as we explored forgotten ghost towns every weekend, hunting through dusty antique shops for hidden treasures and spending hours discussing everything from obscure jazz musicians like Clifford Brown to our shared dreams of traveling to remote observatories in Chile and Hawaii. Lisa was a freelance graphic designer with an artist's discerning eye for beauty and composition, plus a refreshingly practical streak that matched my analytical nature perfectly without making me feel like I needed to apologize for being methodical. She genuinely appreciated how I researched our weekend destinations thoroughly, mapping out the most scenic routes and timing our departures to catch optimal lighting conditions for her ever-present camera and photography hobby. I loved watching her work on location, the way she'd get completely absorbed sketching intricate architectural details in abandoned mining towns or spending 20 minutes setting up elaborate shots of vintage neon signs against dramatic desert sunsets. After 9 incredible months together, moving into my Scottsdale apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic mountain views felt like the most natural progression in the world. We spent entire weekends rearranging furniture and wall space to accommodate both our substantial record collections, creating this perfect blend of her artistic touches and color sense with my organized cataloging systems and custom shelving. Everything about our daily rhythm felt destined. From how we both preferred quiet Saturday mornings with vinyl spinning softly and coffee brewing slowly to our shared excitement about planning elaborate day trips to places neither of us had ever explored. The compatibility was so seamless and effortless that I found myself thinking seriously about engagement rings for the first time in my 31 years, researching vintage settings that would match her artistic sensibilities while imagining the kind of stable, creative future together that I'd never really believed I deserved. But around the 10-month mark, something began shifting in subtle ways I couldn't quite identify at first, changes that coincided perfectly with increased phone contact and weekend plans involving her old sorority sisters from her University of Arizona days. The calls would come at odd hours, long conversations filled with inside jokes and references to people and experiences I knew nothing about, leaving Lisa distracted and somehow different afterward. She'd hang up from these marathon sessions with a distant expression, like she'd been transported back to some version of herself that existed before we met. I started noticing how she'd check her phone more frequently during our weekend adventures, responding to group texts with an urgency that our peaceful moments together had never seemed to inspire. When I'd ask about these friends casually, wondering aloud about meeting them sometime, Lisa would deflect with vague promises about future gatherings that never quite materialized into concrete plans. The woman who used to be completely present during our quiet mornings and desert explorations now seemed to be mentally elsewhere, as if some part of her had been claimed by voices from her past that I wasn't invited to understand. The first time I encountered Lisa's judgmental sorority sisters was at Rebecca Thompson's housewarming party in her upscale Tempe townhouse, an event that immediately felt like walking into hostile territory where I was the unwelcome outsider who had somehow infiltrated their sacred circle. Rebecca greeted Lisa with theatrical squeals and elaborate air kisses while barely acknowledging my existence with a limp handshake, then spent the first 20 minutes giving Lisa an exclusive detailed tour of her professionally decorated space that somehow never included an invitation for me to follow along or participate. When I finally did meet the core group of 5 women, their collective energy felt like a perfectly coordinated psychological attack designed to make me feel inadequate, boring, and completely out of place among their sophisticated social dynamics. Rebecca led the charge with her domineering personality and surgical precision in identifying exactly what would make someone uncomfortable, while the others provided strategic backup through meaningful glances, barely concealed smirks, and perfectly timed interruptions whenever I tried to contribute to conversations. They immediately launched into nostalgic reminiscing about Lisa's college boyfriends, specifically dwelling on the creative entrepreneur types who apparently understood art, passion, and the finer things in life in ways that my systematic analytical career in data science never could hope to match. The conversation was deliberately peppered with subtle but pointed digs about how Lisa used to be so much more spontaneous, adventurous, and intellectually curious before she started dating someone who probably preferred color-coded spreadsheets to spontaneous midnight road trips across state lines. They weaponized their shared 8-year history like a carefully crafted exclusion device, constantly referencing inside jokes from spring break trips to Cabo, formal dances with dates who drove Porsches, and sorority traditions that I obviously couldn't contribute to, understand, or ever hope to be part of as an outsider. Every carefully chosen story they told seemed strategically designed to highlight a version of Lisa that was more exciting, more unpredictable, more worthy of their collective approval than the woman who now spent peaceful weekends antiquing in small towns and stargazing with a guy who worked with databases and statistical models all day. Rebecca made particularly pointed comments about how meaningful relationships should constantly inspire personal growth and exciting adventures rather than settling into comfortable domestic routines that might stifle someone's true potential. She maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact with me during these observations to ensure I understood exactly who she was targeting with her psychological warfare. The most infuriating and heartbreaking part was watching Lisa gradually adapt her responses and even her posture to match their sophisticated energy, actively defending their increasingly aggressive behavior while simultaneously suggesting that maybe I should make more effort to understand their complex dynamic and find creative ways to fit in better with their established group chemistry. When Rebecca made a show of criticizing my choice to order a simple glass of wine instead of joining them in sampling expensive craft cocktails with names I couldn't pronounce, Lisa actually agreed that I could be more flexible and adventurous about trying new experiences instead of always sticking to safe, predictable choices that revealed my limited worldview. I spent the entire evening feeling like I was being systematically dissected by a panel of expert judges who had already reached their unanimous verdict about my fundamental unworthiness, while the woman I loved slowly transformed into someone I barely recognized under their calculated influence and relentless approval-seeking behavior. The drive home was tense and silent, with Lisa staring out the window while I processed what had just happened, realizing that this gathering had been less about celebrating Rebecca's new home and more about establishing exactly where I ranked in their social hierarchy. What followed were months of increasingly sophisticated psychological warfare where Rebecca created impossible double-bind situations that left me feeling like I was losing my mind trying to navigate their twisted social dynamics. If I remained quiet during their gatherings, I was labeled antisocial and boring, someone who clearly didn't appreciate the value of meaningful conversation and intellectual stimulation that their group provided. But if I actively participated by sharing my thoughts or asking questions, I was immediately criticized for being controlling, mansplaining, or trying too hard to dominate conversations that weren't really meant for someone with my limited perspective. Rebecca had perfected the art of making every interaction feel like a carefully designed test that I was destined to fail regardless of my approach or intentions. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a casual wine tasting party at Rebecca's place, an evening that quickly devolved into an orchestrated humiliation designed to showcase exactly how poorly I fit into their sophisticated world. I had spent considerable time researching the wines we'd be sampling and preparing thoughtful conversation starters about the different regions and vintages, genuinely hoping to contribute something meaningful to their discussion and maybe finally find some common ground with this group that meant so much to Lisa. Instead, my carefully prepared observations about terroir and aging processes were met with eye rolls and dismissive comments about how some people couldn't just enjoy an experience without turning it into a boring lecture about technical details that nobody actually cared about. Rebecca made particularly cutting remarks about how typical it was for analytical types to miss the emotional and sensual aspects of wine appreciation by getting bogged down in spreadsheet-worthy facts and figures. When I tried to pivot by asking about their preferences and what they enjoyed about specific bottles, they openly mocked my questions as obviously calculated attempts to manipulate the conversation back to topics I could handle, as if everything I said was part of some sinister strategy to maintain control. The psychological manipulation reached its absolute peak when Lisa pulled me aside that night and revealed something that made my blood run cold with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Rebecca had been secretly recording our private phone conversations for months, carefully analyzing my word choices and conversation patterns to build what she claimed was compelling evidence of my supposedly manipulative communication style and controlling tendencies. Every casual suggestion I'd made about weekend plans, every time I'd expressed an opinion about restaurants or activities, every moment when I tried to be helpful by offering solutions to problems Lisa mentioned, had been meticulously documented and reframed as psychological manipulation through carefully edited audio clips that removed all context and warmth. Rebecca had apparently spent hours creating a comprehensive dossier of my conversational patterns, presenting herself as some kind of expert in recognizing emotional abuse tactics while systematically twisting normal relationship interactions into sinister evidence of my true character. The most chilling part was learning that Rebecca had shared these edited recordings with the entire sorority group, holding what amounted to analysis sessions where they dissected my communication style and reached collective conclusions about my fitness as Lisa's partner based on completely distorted evidence that painted me as some kind of master manipulator. Lisa described these sessions with a mixture of fascination and horror, explaining how Rebecca would play snippets of our conversations and provide expert commentary about subtle manipulation tactics that apparently only she was sophisticated enough to recognize and decode for the group. When I asked to hear these recordings myself, Lisa became defensive and claimed that hearing them would only upset me unnecessarily, since Rebecca had already explained how manipulative people typically respond to being confronted with evidence of their behavior patterns. The gaslighting was so complete and systematic that I began questioning my own sanity, wondering if maybe I really was the controlling person they had painted me as through their carefully orchestrated character assassination campaign. Rebecca had somehow managed to turn every normal relationship interaction into evidence of my unfitness, creating a narrative so compelling that even Lisa was starting to view our previously happy moments through this distorted lens of suspicion and analysis. Everything changed when my colleague Tony Martinez happened to mention something that made my blood freeze during a casual lunch conversation about weekend plans and relationship drama that seemed too familiar for comfort. Tony had dated one of Rebecca's sorority sisters briefly 2 years earlier, and when I described the recording situation and psychological analysis sessions, his face went completely pale with recognition and barely contained anger. He told me that Rebecca had employed these exact same tactics against every single serious boyfriend Lisa had brought around since college, systematically destroying relationships through identical recording strategies and twisted evidence building that she presented as protective friendship and concern for Lisa's well-being. According to Tony, Rebecca had perfected this manipulation over years of practice, always positioning herself as the wise friend who could see through men's deceptive facades while secretly orchestrating their downfall through carefully edited audio evidence and group psychological pressure. The revelation that this was a deliberate pattern rather than genuine concern hit me like a physical blow, but Tony insisted I needed concrete proof before confronting Lisa with accusations that would sound like desperate deflection from someone who'd been caught manipulating conversations. That weekend, I spent hours meticulously documenting everything I could remember and screenshot every suspicious text exchange, creating a comprehensive timeline that showed the systematic nature of Rebecca's interference in our relationship and her consistent pattern of turning Lisa against her romantic partners. When I finally presented Lisa with this evidence, including Tony's first-hand account of Rebecca's previous campaigns and specific examples of how normal conversations had been twisted into sinister narratives, She initially struggled to process the magnitude of betrayal from someone she trusted for 8 years of friendship. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, confusion, anger, and something that looked like genuine horror as she realized how completely she'd been manipulated by someone who claimed to love and protect her from harmful relationships. For exactly 24 hours, it seemed like Lisa was finally seeing Rebecca's behavior for what it truly was, a calculated campaign to control her romantic life through psychological manipulation and systematic isolation from anyone who might threaten Rebecca's position as the most important person in Lisa's world. She even admitted that some of the recordings had seemed strangely edited and that Rebecca's interpretations had felt extreme compared to her actual experience of our conversations and relationship dynamics. But then Rebecca deployed her nuclear option, a counter-explanation so perfectly crafted that it revealed the true depth of her manipulation skills and psychological understanding of how to maintain control when confronted with exposure. Rebecca claimed that I had somehow discovered her protective surveillance and was now fabricating evidence and recruiting accomplices like Tony to gaslight Lisa into doubting the very friend who had been trying to save her from an abusive relationship all along. The accusation was brilliant in its twisted logic, suggesting that my systematic documentation was actually proof of my manipulative nature rather than evidence of Rebecca's campaign against me, and that anyone supporting my version of events was either being manipulated by me or part of some larger conspiracy to isolate Lisa from her true friends. Despite having clear proof of Rebecca's pattern of destroying relationships, despite Tony's corroborating testimony about identical tactics used against previous boyfriends, despite her own initial recognition that something felt wrong about the edited recordings and extreme interpretations, Lisa ultimately chose to believe Rebecca's explanation that I was fabricating evidence to isolate her from protective friends. The devastation of watching someone choose to believe a demonstrably false narrative over documented reality, simply because accepting the truth would mean acknowledging 8 years of friendship had been built on manipulation and control, led to the most painful breakup of my life in ways that I'm still processing months later. The woman who had once trusted my judgment about everything from weekend destinations to major life decisions now viewed my evidence gathering as further proof of my deceptive nature, and my attempts to protect our relationship as confirmation that Rebecca had been right about my controlling tendencies all along. 3 weeks after our devastating breakup, everything changed when Lisa made a discovery that shattered her world in ways that even my documented evidence couldn't have prepared her for. She was borrowing Rebecca's tablet to look up restaurant menus for a girls' night dinner when she accidentally stumbled upon a hidden folder buried deep in Rebecca's photo gallery, a folder that contained hundreds of unsent love letters spanning 6 years of obsessive documentation. The letters revealed Rebecca's romantic fixation on Lisa in explicit detail, chronicling every moment of jealousy, longing, and calculated interference in her romantic relationships since their sophomore year of college when Rebecca first realized her feelings went far beyond friendship. Each letter was dated and meticulously organized, creating a disturbing timeline that showed how Rebecca's obsession had grown more sophisticated and manipulative over the years as she perfected her methods of eliminating romantic competition. The early letters were almost innocent, describing Rebecca's confusion about her feelings and her hope that Lisa might someday see her as more than just a friend, but they gradually evolved into detailed strategic plans for sabotaging relationships and maintaining her position as the most important person in Lisa's life. What made the discovery even more chilling was Rebecca's clinical documentation of her manipulation tactics, describing each boyfriend's personality weaknesses and exactly how she planned to exploit them to create doubt and conflict in Lisa's mind. The letters about me were particularly extensive and detailed, showing how Rebecca had spent months analyzing my behavior patterns, identifying my insecurities about social situations, and crafting specific strategies to make me feel unwelcome and inadequate around their friend group. She had documented her recording plan weeks before implementing it, describing exactly how she would edit conversations to remove context and warmth while preserving words that could be reinterpreted as manipulation or control. Rebecca had even practiced her arguments for why Lisa should trust her judgment over mine, anticipating my likely responses and preparing counternarratives that would make her appear protective rather than possessive. The most heartbreaking part for Lisa was reading detailed descriptions of moments she had thought were genuine friendship, only to discover they were carefully calculated moves in Rebecca's long-term campaign to maintain exclusive emotional access to her life. Every supportive conversation during relationship difficulties, every piece of advice about what to look for in a partner, every warning about men's deceptive nature had been designed to subtly undermine Lisa's confidence in her own judgment while positioning Rebecca as the only person who truly understood and cared about her well-being. When Lisa finally confronted the sorority group about their complicity in Rebecca's manipulation campaign, expecting support and shared outrage about being deceived for years, they turned against her completely with a coordinated response that revealed the true depth of Rebecca's influence over their entire social circle. Instead of expressing horror at Rebecca's documented obsession and systematic destruction of relationships, they chose to believe Rebecca's immediate counternarrative that Lisa was having some kind of psychological breakdown and fabricating evidence to justify her guilt over treating me poorly. Rebecca managed to reframe the discovery as Lisa's desperate attempt to avoid taking responsibility for her relationship failures by creating elaborate conspiracy theories about the friend who had always tried to protect her from making terrible choices. The group's willingness to gaslight Lisa about what she had seen with her own eyes, to dismiss hundreds of documented love letters as some kind of misunderstanding or fabrication, showed just how completely Rebecca had manipulated their perception of reality over the years. Within days, Lisa found herself completely isolated from the friend group that had been the center of her social life for nearly a decade, branded as unstable and delusional for refusing to accept Rebecca's explanations about the innocent nature of her private writings and protective instincts towards someone she cared about deeply. The psychological manipulation was so complete that even when confronted with written evidence of obsession and calculated relationship sabotage, the group chose to believe Rebecca's immediate reframing rather than acknowledge years of systematic deception and control. Lisa called me that night, sobbing and broken, finally understanding the full scope of what Rebecca had done not just to our relationship but to every meaningful connection she tried to build since college. She begged me to meet her somewhere private so she could apologize properly and explain everything she'd discovered about the manipulation we'd both endured, but I had already begun the painful process of moving on and protecting myself from further emotional damage. Despite finally learning the devastating truth about Rebecca's systematic manipulation and romantic obsession, I refused Lisa's increasingly frantic and desperate attempts at reconciliation, having found genuine love with Melody Chen, a talented landscape architect whose appreciation for my analytical nature felt like discovering water after years in an emotional desert. Melody worked for a sustainable design firm specializing in native desert landscaping, and she found my methodical approach to research and planning absolutely refreshing rather than controlling or boring like Lisa's friend group had consistently portrayed it. Our conversations flowed naturally from technical discussions about xerophytic plant adaptations to philosophical debates about balancing human needs with environmental preservation, and she never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for being thorough, systematic, or genuinely interested in understanding complex systems. When I told her about the recording situation and psychological manipulation I'd endured, Melody's response was immediate outrage on my behalf rather than suggestion that maybe I'd somehow contributed to the toxic dynamic through my own behavior patterns. Lisa's reconciliation campaign became increasingly desperate and invasive as she realized I was building something real with someone who actually valued the qualities Rebecca had systematically attacked, leading to workplace ambushes where she would appear in my office building's lobby with elaborate explanations about the manipulation and tearful apologies for choosing Rebecca's version of reality over documented evidence. She sent expensive gifts to my apartment, including a vintage jazz collection that probably cost her several months of freelance income, along with handwritten letters detailing every moment of regret and newfound understanding about how completely she'd been deceived by someone she'd trusted for 8 years of friendship. The gifts felt more like attempts to purchase forgiveness than genuine gestures of remorse, especially since they seemed designed to remind me of our shared history rather than acknowledge the specific ways she'd participated in my emotional destruction. Lisa began showing up at our former favorite locations around Phoenix, timing her appearances to coincide with my usual weekend routines in hopes of manufacturing chance encounters that might lead to meaningful conversations about rebuilding what we'd lost. She would position herself at the vintage record shops we used to browse together, The coffee places where we'd spent lazy Sunday mornings, even the remote stargazing spots in the desert where we'd had our most intimate conversations about dreams and future plans. The stalking behavior culminated in a mortifying scene at the downtown farmers market where Lisa created such a dramatic public confrontation that multiple people recorded the incident on their phones and shared it across social media platforms. She approached Melody and me while we were selecting produce for dinner, launching into a loud, emotional speech about how Rebecca had destroyed our relationship through years of calculated manipulation and how she now understood that I had been the victim of systematic psychological abuse designed to isolate her from genuine love. The public breakdown included detailed descriptions of Rebecca's love letters and obsessive documentation, information that should have remained private but which Lisa shared, desperately hoping to convince everyone within earshot that she deserved another chance to rebuild what had been deliberately destroyed. Bystanders filmed her increasingly unhinged explanations about hidden recordings and friendship betrayal, creating viral content that painted her as an unstable woman having a complete mental breakdown in public rather than someone trying to expose years of manipulation and control. The cruelest twist came when Rebecca and the former friend group participated actively in the online mockery, sharing the videos with comments about how Lisa's behavior proved they'd been right about her psychological instability and tendency toward dramatic fabrications when faced with the consequences of her poor relationship choices. They weaponized her desperate attempt to tell the truth about their manipulation into further evidence of her unreliability, creating a perfect closed loop where any effort to expose their behavior became additional proof of her mental instability and need for the kind of protective intervention they'd always provided throughout their years of friendship. The videos spread beyond their immediate social circle, becoming the kind of viral content that follows someone forever, with strangers commenting on Lisa's appearance, speculating about drug use or mental illness, and creating memes about crazy ex-girlfriends who can't handle rejection gracefully. Watching someone I'd once loved become a cautionary tale about female hysteria while her actual abusers participated in the public humiliation felt like witnessing the final chapter of Rebecca's masterpiece manipulation, where even Lisa's attempt to expose the truth became another tool for maintaining the narrative that she was fundamentally unstable and incapable of healthy relationships. The psychological cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness, transforming a victim's desperate attempt at vindication into viral entertainment that reinforced every stereotype about women who speak out against manipulation and control. 18 months after the devastating end of my relationship with Lisa, I proposed to Melody during a sunrise hot air balloon ride over the magnificent Sonoran Desert, finally finding the kind of deep peace that comes from building a relationship based on mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and complete emotional honesty rather than external validation or social approval from toxic friend groups. The proposal itself reflected everything I'd learned about the difference between performative romance and authentic connection, as I chose a moment that celebrated Melody's love of desert landscapes and early morning tranquility rather than trying to impress anyone else with expensive gestures or social media-worthy settings. Melody's response was characteristically thoughtful and genuine, expressing excitement not just about our engagement but about the specific way I'd chosen to honor her interests and personality in planning such a meaningful moment that reflected our shared values and quiet compatibility. Our wedding planning process became another testament to how healthy relationships actually function, with both of us contributing ideas and making decisions together without any external pressure or manipulation from friends who might have hidden agendas about controlling our choices or maintaining their own positions of influence in our lives. Meanwhile, Lisa had made the difficult but necessary decision to move to Denver for a complete fresh start, recognizing that staying in Phoenix meant constantly confronting reminders of the toxic dynamics and manipulative relationships that had defined her social world for nearly a decade since college. She entered therapy with a specialist in psychological abuse and manipulation, beginning the long process of understanding how someone she trusted completely had systematically undermined her judgment, isolated her from healthy relationships, and convinced her to participate in the emotional destruction of people who genuinely cared about her well-being and happiness. The therapeutic work was apparently intense and painful, involving detailed examination of how Rebecca's grooming and control had affected every aspect of her decision-making process, From career choices to romantic relationships to basic self-trust and confidence in her own perceptions of reality. Lisa had to confront the devastating realization that many of her strongest convictions about love, friendship, and personal worth had been carefully shaped by someone whose ultimate goal was maintaining exclusive emotional access rather than supporting her genuine growth and independence. Through months of consistent therapy and the geographic distance from her former social circle, Lisa gradually began rebuilding her sense of self and developing the kind of healthy boundaries that might have protected her from Rebecca's manipulation if she'd understood these concepts years earlier when their friendship was first establishing its toxic patterns. A full year after I'd married Melody in an intimate desert ceremony surrounded by family members and genuine friends who celebrated our happiness without any hidden agendas or attempts to undermine our relationship, Lisa sent me a mature and thoughtful message through LinkedIn that demonstrated remarkable personal growth and self-awareness about everything that had transpired between us. The message took full responsibility for her role in allowing Rebecca's manipulation to destroy our relationship, acknowledged the specific ways she'd participated in making me feel unwelcome and inadequate around her friend group, and expressed genuine happiness about my marriage to someone who clearly appreciated and valued the qualities that Rebecca had systematically attacked during our time together. What struck me most about Lisa's message was its complete lack of self-pity or attempts to minimize Rebecca's responsibility while simultaneously taking full ownership of her own choices and the damage they had caused to someone who had genuinely loved and supported her throughout our relationship. She described her ongoing therapy work and the painful process of learning to trust her own judgment again after years of having her perceptions constantly undermined and redirected by someone she'd believed had her best interests at heart when the reality was far more sinister and self-serving. Lisa also shared that she'd eventually found her own path toward healing and healthy relationships in Denver, having learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulative behavior and developed the kind of strong personal boundaries that might have protected her from Rebecca's systematic control if she'd understood these concepts during our time together. The message concluded with a sincere wish for my continued happiness and a brief mention that she'd found someone in Colorado who appreciated her artistic nature while respecting her need for independence and emotional growth, suggesting that her therapeutic work had helped her understand what healthy partnership actually looked like when it wasn't being undermined by toxic outside influences. My response was brief but genuine, thanking her for the apology and expressing real happiness that she'd found the strength to rebuild her life and learn from the manipulation we'd both endured, while also acknowledging that her journey toward healing took tremendous courage and self-reflection that not everyone would be willing to undertake after such devastating betrayal. The exchange provided a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed, confirming that people can indeed grow and change when they choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and genuine self-examination over the easier path of blaming external circumstances for their choices and their consequences. Looking back on the entire experience now, from the perspective of someone who found genuine happiness with a partner who values authenticity, I can see how Rebecca's manipulation was a masterclass in psychological control that exploited normal human needs for belonging and validation to achieve her twisted romantic goals. The sophistication of her approach, from systematic recording and editing of private conversations to careful cultivation of group dynamics that made questioning her judgment feel like betrayal, revealed someone who weaponized basic social instincts against their targets. What makes the story even more chilling is understanding that Rebecca likely viewed herself as the hero protecting Lisa from unworthy partners while positioning herself as the only person who truly understood and deserved Lisa's love throughout their friendship. Melody and I often discuss the experience as a cautionary tale about trusting your own perceptions when someone makes you feel consistently unwelcome, especially when their criticism seems designed to undermine your confidence rather than help you grow in meaningful ways. The contrast between my experience with Lisa's toxic friend group and my reality with Melody couldn't be more stark, as every interaction reinforces my sense of being appreciated and valued for exactly who I am rather than being treated like a threat requiring careful manipulation. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if Lisa had possessed stronger boundaries when she first became close to Rebecca during college, whether early intervention might have prevented years of undermined relationships. I spent the entire evening feeling like I was being dissected by a panel of experts who had already reached their verdict about my worthiness, while the woman I loved slowly transformed into someone I barely recognized under their influence.